We are joined today by Dr. David Martin, who has been a global leader in exposing I think I've been generous in the title where I've said global fraudsters. These people are criminals throughout the pandemic. And the most recent revelation that he's come public with is Trudeau's involvement in this illegal monopoly with evidence, which you did send me over the weekend, Dr. Martin, and I did share with my audience. And he's joining us today for more on that. Dr. David Martin, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Maria, it's an honor, and as I wake up every morning to an Australian accent, I have to say it's lovely to be surrounded by the beautiful sounds of the accent that I have come to know and love, and I have been a big fan of my travels there for the last 20 years.
Well, I'll tell you what, you wouldn't be a fan of traveling here right now, Dr. Martin. We are in some serious
I don't think that they'd probably be overly enthusiastic about giving me a visa right now. I'm pretty sure ScoMo probably has a short list and I'm on it.
We'll talk about ScoMo a bit later on, but I think I really want to get started with this most pressing news, which is Trudeau's involvement in this illegal monopoly. Now, Dr. Robert Malone recently did an interview on another show where he spoke about the possibility of Trudeau's family being involved in or having 40% shares in Acuitas. Can you verify those claims for us and tell us about that relationship, please?
Well, Acuitas is difficult to verify. If you go back and look at the history of this, University of British Columbia began their licensing of the lipid nanoparticle in 1998. And you heard the date right? Remember Operation Warp Speed? I think it should have been called Operation Slow Molasses because the fact of the matter is this was not something that happened overnight. But in 2015, it became abundantly clear that the both Moderna and BioNTech developments of mRNA were going to be requiring the use of technology that came out of the University of British Columbia. And the story, Maria, is actually somewhat convoluted because what happened was there was a company called Tecmira Pharmaceuticals. They don't exist anymore. But Tecmira Pharmaceuticals was the first group that kind of took the University of British Columbia technologies out. That became absorbed into Inex Pharmaceuticals, and Inex Pharmaceuticals became Arbutus. And Arbutus and Acuitas are the most bizarre corporation story you've ever seen, because what happened was a disgruntled founder shareholder of Arbutus decided to run off with trade secrets associated with the lipid nanoparticle. And there's been countless litigations between Arbutus and Acuitas all over the exact same thing. So let's get really clear. They're fighting over the holy grail of the lipid nanoparticle that is used to inject mRNA into people. And their lawsuits essentially come down to what is very clearly a very small-minded fight around intellectual property and trade secrets, which is the reason why I've been kind of pointing to this story for an extremely long time, because it is in fact both companies, both Arbutus and Acuitas, that actually live inside of this interesting Trudeau-controlled criminal monopoly. What makes the official owning of who owns Acuitas difficult is they do not report in any public market. So all you can do is by inference go back and try to piece together what happened. What we know is that in 2018 and 2019, when there was a giant dispute, first between Acuitas and Arbutus, and then between Acuitas, Moderna, and Arbutus, which gave rise in 2019 going into 2020 of Moderna trying to sue to invalidate the entire patent portfolio that was associated with the lipid nanoparticle. We see fragments of ownership. But the reason why I'm answering you with such a long answer is the answer is Acuitas is somewhat of an unknown entity in terms of all of the funding issues and all the funding threads, because it really was just a few years ago, nothing more than one guy who had essentially appropriated technology that was then subject to litigation around a theft of trade secret and misappropriations of licenses. The fact of the matter is he's lost. He's not a person who is overly prone to integrity, given the fact that what we see is entering into license agreements that he was not allowed to enter into, working with Moderna when he was not allowed to. There's a whole lot of things about this that are wrong. But the long and short of it is, regardless of how this soap opera plays out, and by the way, it is basically a soap opera, regardless of how it plays out, the point doesn't change. Trudeau is presiding over an illegal monopoly. He is allowing two competitors to price fix an extortion on the world. And that's an illegal thing to do, no matter who owns what.
So, as I said, I did share your video, but for the audience who haven't seen that yet, please, can you go into for us exactly what you mean by that statement you just made?
Yeah, so antitrust or monopoly laws say that it is illegal to, in fact, price fix. In other words, get involved in negotiations that are anti-competitive, that are anti-consumer, that are harmful to the marketplace, where you essentially are the person who controls the outcome of what are supposed to be commercially competitive products. It's actually an illegal thing. And it's illegal to do that in most civilized countries. Monopolies and the ability for internal price fixing among competitors is considered to be a corrupt business practice. And that's a corrupt business practice. Here in the United States, it's covered under our antitrust laws. Around the world, it's covered under all kinds of laws around business corruption, graft, all that kind of stuff. When you do a license of technology in which you have a vested interest that you do not disclose, which is the problem with Trudeau. When in April of 2020, he said, hey, everybody, we're not going to get out of this without a vaccine. The evidence was clear that the statement he was making was false commercially. Because it turns out in April of 2020, we had numerous treatments available for coronavirus. Those treatments were illegally suppressed, which is an antitrust and also an anti-competitive violation of the law. They were suppressed. And then preferential treatment was given to his technology. So in other words, what he did was he shut down competition. And then lo and behold, the only solution the world had was the one he controlled. That's a crime.
And what does this mean for other countries? Because we've seen the same approach in every country.
Yeah, well, see, that's the funny thing. What happened was, and you know this, Maria, the script that has been read from teleprompters around the world, and this is seriously nothing more than Operation Mockingbird with heads of state, where whether it was Angela Merkel, whether it was Justin Trudeau, whether it was Donald Trump, whether it was Scott Morrison, where they kind of did their monologue of we will not return to normal until there is a vaccine. It's as though they were possessed by their teleprompter. Those statements were, in fact, nothing more than the expression of a criminal conspiracy. Because the fact is, we've experienced coronavirus infections numerous times. We have had infections of influenza. We've had infections of all sorts of other pathogens. We have never in the history of humanity declared by fiat that only one technology will get us out of the problem. And so what we know is that this was a scripted, premeditated action taken by people who told us that they were going to do it. In September of 2019, the World Health Organization, World at Risk, very clearly stated that we were going to have an exercise around the world that had to be completed by September 2020, where we had the world respond to an intentional or accidental release of a respiratory pathogen. So the bad news is, this is not Dave's allegation. This was them announcing what they were going to do. This is them telling the world what they were going to do. And if you go back to 2011 and read the Decade of the Vaccine report, which was Anthony Fauci's declaration that by 2020, vaccination would be a human right, meaning that everyone on the planet would be subject to a universal vaccine.
Which he's trying to implement now. He's been talking about this miracle vaccine that will cover all variants and need to be taken every year.
No. This is not about variants. This is a universal vaccine template for everything. This is flu. This is cold. This is hepatitis. This is AIDS. This is you name it. Think of it this way. Coronavirus was meant to be the operating system. Think of it as a computer. It was meant to be the operating system upon which we built application boosters. So I need you to think of mRNA and the lipid nanoparticle that Justin Trudeau controls as the Microsoft OS or the Apple OS. And then what I need to think of is every other pathogen, every other variant, every other booster as an upgrade to your application. You know, there's annoying things that happen when your software says, oh, updating, and you shut down your computer. Well, that's what you're having happen in your body, which is kind of a bummer of a place to have that happen. The whole reboot, shutdown, blue screen of death kind of thing. You don't want that to happen. So this whole thing is actually a very well-defined, very well-announced, very well-architected platform, which was always intentional, always aligned for one singular objective, and that was to get to a place where every single human being on the planet started life with an operating system that was delivered by industrial pharmaceuticals and then was dependent for the rest of time on application layer upgrades.
So, okay, let's talk about that. In my interview with Karen Kingston, the first one we ever did, she showed us from the patents, every single patent that is approved, the World Health Organization, vaccines that are approved, have a plan for never-ending vaccines, tracking, integration with AI. We have the evidence of exactly what you're saying.
Oh, yeah.
If any of the viewers have missed that interview, it's there. It's in the patent.
And I have all 4,000 patents in the Fauci dossier that cover the entirety of this whole thing, where we have every subcomponent of every pathogen already patented. So the entire thing, you know, when I published the Fauci dossier, people didn't even know that all of this goes back to patents filed by Pfizer in 1990.
My goodness. Now, you said recently that it was never about health, but all about maintaining Trudeau's illegal monopoly. And the statements that you made in your interview that you recently did with on the Stu Peters show was that this is essentially people's last chance to take a civil stand before they can exercise their constitutional rights against a criminal government.
That's exactly right.
What happened on the weekend with the courts in Canada?
Well, so the bad news is that the courts opened up the Freedom Bridge. They did a court order. They arrested some people. They opened up the Freedom Bridge, but they did not succeed in clearing out Ottawa. And the truckers in Ottawa stayed. They have continued to stay. Justin Trudeau, as a despotic, seriously, as just nothing more than a sociopath, decided yesterday that he was going to declare effective martial law in Canada, making himself the tyrant in chief, suspending the Constitution, doing horrific things to ultimately reach into exactly where they want to go. And if you look at where they went, Maria, it's important to realize that they never mentioned coronavirus. What they did do is they actually mentioned the fact that this was the government's reach into cryptocurrencies and alternative currencies. Yes. This was not about coronavirus. I have said since the beginning, and I've been criticized for saying it, but now inconveniently, the bad news is they said it on their press conference. This was about turning domestic opposition to political despots into a definition of terrorism, akin to what the Scott Morrison government did in Australia a couple of years ago. You know, going back to 2018, when Australia decided to legislate the fact that now anybody holding any electronic device in Australia is subject to a capricious march-in right, where the government has absolute right and authority to march in and take whatever they want, whenever they want, including cracking the Apple security system. And that's something that passed in 2018 with barely a whimper in Australia. And you sit back and you say...
They went a step further last year, Dr. Martin, and they actually now have a legislation that allows authorities to log into any of your social media or accounts, post on your behalf, delete whatever they want. It's insanity. And the other thing that Trudeau's just done is frozen people's bank accounts, but also from what I'm hearing, he's used it to interfere with crypto, which is exactly what you're saying right now.
Right. And remember that you guys probably covered the ASIO case and the ASIO influence in what was going on with the Bitcoin origination story, the litigation that took place last year in Australia around who really was the real founder of, the Bitcoin, and who was the original kind of creator of the Bitcoin blockchain. That legislation and that litigation became very interesting to decipher and disentangle, because what we saw was that this has always been an intent to map social behavior, to identify patterns of networks, to figure out who's funding who and who's exchanging value with who and who's in each other's kind of orbit. And there is nothing like getting people into the honeypot of the blockchain and crypto movement to find out who is associating with who. If you are a government intent on controlling the narrative to the point of suppressing human rights, what you need a map of who talks to who engages with who exchanges value with who, because that map allows you to choke off anything that is dissent from the government's narrative.
We have that map through crypto and also through the vaccines, correct?
Absolutely. And we're putting all of this information together. People have asked me many times, what if we ultimately have some sort of, social score a la China? And I laugh when people ask me, what if we have it? We already do. And the sad thing is, we've had it for a long time. Most people don't know about Sabre. And I can watch your eyes and I can see you don't know about Sabre.
No, I don't.
This actually started back when we did online booking for hotels and airplanes and everything else. Anytime any human being moved, all of that information was actually consolidated in government servers so that we could track everybody's movement everywhere on the globe. And the universal connection that allowed these very convenient things, like if you got a flight canceled on one airline, you could be rebooked on another, and you sat back and go, oh, how did that work? How is it? Well, it's because it all ran through the same system, the Sabre system. And people didn't know about that. And people didn't know about the fact that there are things called call data logs, or CDRs, call data records, which are actually the amount of time that you spend on the phone calling somebody, where you actually measure and map the networks of every single interaction that's taken place on every single phone that exists in any cellular or digital network. And we didn't do anything about that. The fact of the matter is, we've already been living in that social score. We've already been living in that system. We just don't know it. And now the fact that it is becoming visible is in fact a little late, because the horse is already out of the stable. And what we need to be doing right now is recognizing that our complicity and participation on the incremental losses of liberty, each little time we were like, I don't read the whole license agreement, and I don't go to the bottom of the page, and I didn't look at what really happened when Microsoft settled with the Justice Department back with the Obama administration. All those things that we just kind of looked past, we now realize each and every one of those was one more increment as we forged the chain of our own slavery. And they did it under the cunning guise of technology convenience.
I was just about to say, all in the name of convenience. And now we're in a position where we need this technology to keep getting the truth out. So we're stuck in this loop.
Well, as I said in one of our Activate Humanity shows a few months ago, this is actually another moment where we are actually priming yet another branch of tyranny, which will in fact shut down. And it will shut down. They've already told us it's going to happen. So the entire cyber infrastructure, which going back to the DARPANET and ARPANET, back when the internet was just starting, this was set up not for communication. This was not set up as a social experiment of some sort of liberty promotion. This was set up as a single point failure where you could collect all of humanity to connect like you and I are connecting right now. And if we ever need to do it, we'll just shut it off. So one of the things that I've done is I've made sure that what I am doing constantly is connecting with people, quite literally, having people to our home, going to places of assembly, because it turns out that what they cannot do easily is shut down the assembly of people. It's much easier to turn off the internet.
this what the World Economic Forum is referring to when they talk about cyber COVID, the cyber pandemic, much faster spreading than COVID? Talk us through that, please.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. First of all, the way the internet was built, it was built on the back of what was the National Telecommunications Act in the 1960s here in the United States, which essentially gave this, for those of you who want a little bit of history, come out of the Bay of Pigs invasion when Kennedy and Khrushchev were kind of at each other's throats with respect to the weaponization of nuclear weapons into Cuba. And during the Bay of Pigs invasion, there was a concern that the government might not be able to get access to the telephone lines back then. And so the National Telecommunications Act provided what was called a voice override system, which allowed for a prioritization of signals and the suppression of other signals. And we've been living with that, by the way, since the 1960s. AT&T implemented that fully by 1967, and we've been living in that system for the last, now 54 years. Ironically, I don't think most people know that, which means that even on a classic telephone line, we can actually have that access cut off, and it can be done instantaneously and capriciously, and all the switches are already there. Now, put the internet on top of that. 1980s and 1990s, what we did was we started building these node network connections for the internet, which is how the internet actually works. And it turns out that based on the traffic and based on the priority and based on the nature of the signal, meaning, am I saying something that is in opposition to something that a government agency decides I shouldn't say? They literally can, in their spread spectrum, close down my line to make it impossible for people to hear me. That's something that is already in place. And there's another thing that most of your listeners and viewers probably haven't paid much attention to. Over the last 6 months, a lot of nations have been testing what are called hypersonic unmanned air vehicles. So these are UAVs, and they are flying at what's called Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound. Go back and look at this and look at actually what this was. And Russia tested them, North Korea tested them, other people tested them. The US tried to test one and it didn't work. But the reason why we have these, what are called suborbital UAVs, which are these things that fly far enough above the atmosphere that they can fly at enormously fast speeds. So they can't be tracked. We don't have countermeasures to attack them. But the reason why those things exist is to deliver what are called low altitude detonations. Now, what that is when you blast an atomic device high enough above the ground so that it actually doesn't have a thermo effect or a mechanical effect on the ground, meaning that we don't have a kinetic collapse of buildings, we don't have potentially a lot of lethality. But what does happen is a very large electromagnetic pulse comes out of the sky and actually fries absolutely every electronic system that exists. That means your car won't start. That means your phone won't work. That means your refrigerator, your microwave, anything that has electronics in it is dead. And I don't mean dead like it's not working today. I mean it becomes a paperweight. It is never going to work again because what it does is it fries the circuits in these devices. The fact of the matter is those were tested last year. And everybody sat there going, oh, wow, a really fast rocket, whatever. No, not whatever. That was an agency for the payload of exactly the thing I'm talking about. This is where you can fly over an urban area. You can blast a high energy device, usually a subcritical atomic weapon. That blast, that EMP pulse, comes down and actually destroys absolutely every electronic thing that is on the ground. That means people's pacemakers stop working. That means people's oxygen distribution. That means hospitals shut down. That means everything shuts down. So when we think about this kind of digital winter or the digital disruption or all of the kind of cyber warfare scenarios that have been popularized since 2018, what we're not paying attention to is the systems are already being tested. And Maria, I've never seen a government test a thing that they didn't intend to use.
100%. Are you saying then that those exercises that we've seen, there was one in Israel towards the end of last year, and there was another one run in Europe this year?
Yeah.
Are they just for show then because they already actually have those systems in place, or does that mean that we are very close?
Yeah, well, I said that close to a year ago, I did a show on this because I was surprised at how many people were unaware of it. And by the way, there's some amazing stuff out on EMPs if you want to read about them. But the fact of the matter is, this is something I briefed the Rumsfeld administration on, and that means back in President Bush. So we're talking 2006, 7, and 8. I talked about that back then, and I said, it's coming. Well, it turns out it's coming is now around the corner. The capability is already there. I don't know if you saw just a week and a half ago that allegedly a very, very significant solar flare knocked 40 satellites out of orbit. 40. Now, we were told that it was a solar flare. I went back and actually looked at the solar data, and I don't think it was a solar flare. I think it was a test. And 40 satellites went down. They are allegedly entering the Earth's orbit and are going to burn up before they actually land. It's part of the great plan that, allegedly was all in fully operational design mode. That's what they wanted to do. But the fact of the matter is, we are living in this period of time where people say, well, these things are too complicated. There are too many tentacles on this beast to try to understand it. And the fact of the matter is, we actually do have the ability to have these conversations, to inform people, to get them ready, because at the end of the day, these are things that can only happen when they are done in covert ways. You and I having this conversation makes it less likely for the event to occur.
Do you think, though, that this is going to be their next plan of attack? Because many of us are looking and saying, we don't know what the next steps are. We see that the COVID narrative is failing. Too many people are aware. We have well over 3% of the global population aware of what's going on. And more of their fraud and illegal activity is coming out. So this is the next step to cover their tracks?
Yeah, so it's an important next step, because we've got a date certain with an inevitability that no one is talking about. Well, no one save yours truly. And the thing that is certain is that in the United States, our Social Security system becomes insolvent in 2028, meaning that the trust fund that supports our Medicare and our Medicaid system goes to zero in 2028. Now, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is the world has become addicted to American debt. And I don't care what country you're living in, a significant amount of the assets held by every government are U.S. debt denominated assets. They buy U.S. treasuries because allegedly it's a safe bet. Well, the problem is it's a safe bet until the day it isn't. Kind of like in 1971 when everybody said, well, nobody would ever default on a gold standard, right? Except then one day, President Nixon just decided on a weekend to go, yep, we're off of that. That is the caprice that we are going to see again. And in this particular case, this is much more damaging because, unfortunately, in Australia, in your superannuation funds, which the government requires every Australian to have, in those superannuation funds, the exposure that the average Australian has is somewhere between 7 and 13% in this problem. And guess what? You're not being told about that. No Australian's being told about that. But how would you feel if you woke up one day and saw that 7 to 13% of your superannuation fund disappeared? Not just went down, just disappeared, just gone, see you later. And by the way, you're not allowed in Australia to actually pull your money out if the manager is doing a terrible job managing your funds. But that shouldn't bother you because you are actually an Australian. And of course, the government's always looking out for you.
Oh, of course. We can see what a great job they've been doing of that.
Yeah.
Truly showed their true colors, Dr. Martin.
Yeah. I mean, in 2018, remember, we had this amazing inquiry in Australia into the mismanagement of pensions and superannuation and everything else. And by the way, nothing happened. We found out that there was terrible corruption. I published a report that showed that the average Australian was losing somewhere between 2 to 3% annually on the exact same portfolio if that portfolio had been invested outside of Australia. So Australians are paying a tax they don't even know they're paying. And you know how much press that got? Absolutely none. And that report, by the way, was in fact sent to Scott Morrison because one of his best friends delivered it to him. So somewhere along the line, ScoMo doesn't seem to actually care about promoting the future of Australia the way he alleges to. So I don't know, maybe I'm making an allegation, except for the fact I have the evidence.
Wow. No, he certainly doesn't care for the people, Dr. Martin. He's got evidence of multiple adverse reactions. We have confirmation that he's been sent that evidence. He doesn't do a thing with it. He is absolutely part of this plan. And I want to talk about him now. What other evidence do we have to suggest that Scott Morrison is part of this global agenda?
Well, let's start with something simple. Back several years ago, you may know this, I ran the Center of Applied Innovation down in Melbourne. And when I was there, I was very fascinated by the fact that I landed in Victoria just as the automotive industry was, crumbling. So all the area around Geelong and kind of that whole bit of the western side of the bay there was going through some pretty remarkable economic hardship. And so what happened was there was an enormous amount of effort. By the way, Scott Hunt, who I think is now an expert allegedly in health in Australia, how he got that expertise, I will never know.
Greg Hunt, yes.
Sorry, Greg Hunt. Yeah. When I first met him, he was certainly incapable of rubbing two sticks together to figure out what health is. I don't know how he suddenly became a minister for it. But I had many interactions with him and with other members of his government where we were talking about what to do next. And one of the things that I found was that Australia is living in a very bizarre bubble because on the one hand, close to 80% of the economic interactions that Australia has are with a counterparty to the north called China. And that has to do with steel. It has to do with coal. It has to do with now a lot of agriculture products. But at the end of the day, you have an 80% dependency on China. And I was surprised by the fact that Australia and its government were pursuing allegedly military procurements that were allegedly aligned against China. And I thought that was kind of bizarre. So I hosted a conference at the Center of Applied Innovation, and I hosted a conference in Melbourne. And I raised the very interesting issue that back then there was a thing called the land vehicle procurement. And what that was the government of Australia deciding to buy a bunch of armored personnel carriers, and they were going to make those armored vehicles in Australia, which sounds like a lovely idea. Now, if we pause for a moment and reflect on the fact that Australia is an island, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's an island. It's a big island, but it's an island. So last time I checked, having land vehicles and armored land vehicles is really not a strategic asset if you're in Australia, because you'd have to drive them somewhere. And I know that we're always worried about the great, northern expansion where the Northern Territories and the Western Australian crazies are going to jump kangaroos across the line, and we're going to need to get APVs out there to attack them. But let's face the facts. There is no tactical military reason for spending billions of dollars to build land vehicles. But that didn't stop the government from saying that that's what they wanted to do. And the reason I'm telling you the story is it's really important. I actually pointed out, and I went to a briefing at the barracks for the Australian Defence Force there in Victoria in Melbourne. And I went to the barracks and I briefed a brigadier general on the fact that the vehicles that Australia was purchasing had armor, in other words, the protective shell on the outside of the vehicle, that had already been shown to be compromised by Russian rocket-propelled grenades. In other words, you were buying vehicles that the technology already existed to pierce the armor of that vehicle. And I suggested that that's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to spend money to build a thing where there already is a countermeasure that makes the thing nothing more than a death trap for members of the Australian Defence Force. And I had that conversation with this brigadier general.
And what was the response?
He told me that this was, quote, a necessary procurement for the preservation of the Australian government system. Now,
peculiar wording.
Oh, no. And it gets a little better. It gets really a lot better because I said, Brigadier General, you are going to have Australian young men and women who are going to be deployed in some far off land. They're going to be told they're driving an armored vehicle. They're going to drive into a combat theater thinking that they're protected because of the kind of name armored. They're going to go into a theater thinking they're protected. A rocket propelled grenade is going to go through the housing of that vehicle, and it's going to blow up inside of that compartment, and it's going to kill Australians. And you're telling me this is just to support the Australian government's procurement system? And he said, yes. And then it got slightly worse. He warned me and threatened me that if I ever said anything about this, it would be, quote, bad for me because they have ways of settling scores. Now, that's a brigadier general in the Australian Army. Unfortunately for him, and I guess not unfortunately for me, I went ahead and wrote up that briefing and then sent it. And among the people who have received that briefing are your current prime minister, who did absolutely nothing with that information. Now, here's the problem. The problem is Australia is not playing as a principal actor on the global stage. It's playing as a theater piece where, and we saw this just last year, you cancel your DCNS contract with French submarines, and then you buy nuclear submarines in violation of a very long-standing Australian policy of no nukes in the Pacific around Australia. That is your policy. But suddenly it's okay to buy American nuclear submarines? That's ridiculous. But somehow or another, they get away with it because nobody says anything. But they get away with it to preserve the illusion of an interaction with NATO and the United States, while their primary trading partner is China. What's wrong with this? What's wrong with it is Australia does not have an identity that is separate from being a pawn on other people's chessboards. And this is the tragedy of what's happening in the government right now. Scott Morrison and Greg Hunt could not, if I actually sat in front of them and said, can you tell me exactly what an mRNA injection does? Not one of them could actually answer the question with a modicum of science. Not one of them. Certainly not Greg Hunt, because he's dumb enough to think that what they're injecting into people is actually something that triggers immunity. And that's a false statement, because what they're injecting into people is something that triggers the creation of a coronavirus modeled spike protein. It does not trigger an immunity.
Correct.
But Greg doesn't know that. Scott Morrison doesn't know that because he's a talking head puppet that says, oh, it's a vaccine, therefore we need to have people take vaccines. They wouldn't know what any of this was if it bit them in the bum. And that's the problem.
Who is Scott Morrison's puppeteer then?
Well, the puppeteer is clearly the financial markets that are propping up everything about the counter trade of two primary things, steel and coal right now. And the fact of the matter is those financial interests are the same financial interests that are controlling Pfizer and Moderna. It's BlackRock, it's State Street, it's Vanguard. It's the financial institutions to which they're beholden. And don't think for a minute that if you looked at his travel record, you wouldn't see him coming to New York and going exactly to those locations. Because remember, that's where he used to travel back in the day when he used to be kind of the CFO for Australia instead of the prime minister for Australia. People forget that these positions are not accidental. He didn't get there because there's a fabulous public uprising that says that we love Scott Morrison any more than Justin Trudeau got into being the prime minister because the giant, plurality of Canada decided they liked him. Justin Trudeau couldn't even get a simple majority of Canadian votes, but he thinks that he actually is popular. He's not popular. He is the bully on the school ground that thought that somehow or another, because somebody put a pin on him, he was somehow entitled to be dux of the school. Well, newsflash, he's not. And he's not the smartest guy in the room, and he's not the most competent, and he's not even popular. And the same, unfortunately, can be said for what's happening in most of the Commonwealth, because what we see in the Commonwealth is that the British Empire gave itself up a long time ago. And by a long time ago, I mean 1604. It gave itself up to the British East India Company, which is now the Wellcome Trust, which is now Pfizer, which is now AstraZeneca, which is now Moderna, which is now all the drug companies, because that's who it is. And this is the oldest criminal organization on the planet. It's been running since 1604, and it is, in fact, what continues to control the world today.
So when Dr. Robert Malone said to me, your country is essentially owned by Pfizer, he wasn't kidding.
No, not at all. That's not a metaphor.
Is there anything that can be done about it, Dr. Martin?
Well, yes. Start with, you know what? Stop saying that you have a really great public health system, because you don't. You have a very efficient drug dealing system. It's time that Australians stop pretending that the government and the controlled monopoly of government healthcare is a good thing. And I've been around a lot of Australians who sit there, and Canadians for that matter, who sit there going, well, at least we have healthcare. Well, yeah. And that's like saying, well, at least I live in a crack house. The good news is the drugs are free. The bad news is it's a crack house. And I'm not being metaphoric in that statement. The error that we've made is anytime we think we're getting something for free, we're not looking behind the curtain. We're not saying, okay, so if that is free, who's paying for it? And do not think for a moment that anybody, I mean, listen, how quickly did the academic medical community in Australia fall for this thing? There was no independent inquiry. You didn't see any of the medical universities in Australia standing up and saying, hey, we've got independent queries. Listen, Japan, remember, Japan, one of the most civilized, polite societies on the planet, who is least likely to ever complain. Japan was saying, hey, we've tested what's in these Moderna shots and it's not acceptable and we're going to reject lots. Japan had the decency to do that. Did anybody in Australia do that? Nope. And, you know, when the Japanese are the first to actually suggest that maybe something's wrong, a bigger something is wrong. Because the bigger something that's wrong is that should have been the academic medical centers in places like New Zealand and Australia. But that didn't happen because nobody looked.
I think it's deeper than that, Dr. Martin, in the sense that I don't think that Greg Hunt is unaware. We had a testimony from a doctor who actually wrote to him to talk about the risks and the adverse events that this particular doctor was seeing. And the next day, that doctor had the police at their house raiding it, and they said, don't ever write to Greg Hunt again. Yeah. I don't think Greg Hunt is unaware at all. And
well, no. And if you're mishearing me thinking that these things are innocent, they're not innocent. They're complicit. When you're given positions, but listen to this. Greg Hunt was incompetent when he was in Victorian government. So put him in a national position as, health minister. He wasn't competent in any of the things he did. He was born in the right district to go to the right boys' school, to be in the right boys' club. One of the things I found out by being a man moving from America to live in Australia was if you didn't go to the right grammar school, you were not in the right club. If you weren't in the right club, you didn't have the right, football team that you barracked for. You didn't have the right whatever. This is an old problem, and the old problem is competence has never been welcome. This is about what you have in terms of the club credentials. You have to be in each other's, private lounges at the opposite ends of Collins Street in Melbourne, or who's got the right box at Randwick, or who's got the whatever else. This is not about leadership. This is about patronage. And every single one of the people that I interacted with, and I don't have any exception to this, every single one of them had a paymaster.
Right. And we know that they were also, Scott Morrison and Greg Hunt both. Greg Hunt is one of the graduates of the Young Global Leaders program, Klaus Schwab's School for Tyrannical Pets. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the problem I think many of us have is we try to infer rationality on people who are sociopaths. I think the average person wants to live in a world, and I certainly am married to one, wants to live in a world where the best of humanity is your default assumption. So we go through the world actually thinking, probably people are basically good. And I would say that on the main, that's probably a true assumption because I've traveled the world over. I've lived in many countries, and I will tell you that the average person with whom I've met is a good person. They work hard, they're honest, they care about their family, they care about their community, they care about causes that matter to them. They're good people. And one of the things that I find so offensive about what's happening in this current exercise is that we are trying as good human beings that bring a rational, kind action to the table. We are trying to rationalize the behavior of sociopaths. And we almost are mystified that somebody could be that bad. You know, I on all of the shows that I talk on, one of the things that I mentioned is Peter Daszak. And Peter Daszak, the money launderer in chief that facilitated the bioweaponization of coronavirus collaboration between North Carolina and the United States and Wuhan and China. Peter Daszak in 2015 said, to increase the public's understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-coronavirus vaccine, we need the media to create hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage. Investors will follow if they see profit at the end of the process. That is a quote.
Yes, I've read this.
That was a quote from 2015, published by the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. Maria, that's an admission of domestic terrorism. That is an admission of bioweapons. That is an admission of genocide. And we sit there going, oh, man, he couldn't have really meant that. Like, there's got to be a better explanation for that. We are trying to look at a bank robber standing on the steps of a bank holding a bag of money. We're trying to figure out how to get that bank robber to check on bank security. Because we're just good people, and we think that would be a logical thing to do.
I guess the problem that we have, Dr. Martin, is that all of these people, we have so much evidence now of all of their crimes, and most people in my audience, and you know, I see it all over. Okay, we know they're murderers. We know that this is premeditated murder. We know they're criminals, fraudsters, whatever names you want to give them. They're psychopaths. What do we do about it? There is evidence. Why are they not in prison?
So first and foremost, what I've been doing, and I think you know this, what I've been doing is I've been preparing documents that can be delivered at the local level, where people can go to their local district attorneys or their prosecutors, or wherever you are in the world, you can actually take the same evidence to any law enforcement and put them on notice. Then the other thing people can do, and by the way, in Australia, you have a better system than we have here, which is as you go into your provincial or your local elections, actually sit down with your candidates before you elect them and say, are you prepared to sign an affidavit that says that when you get into office, you will actually bring charges. And if you don't, you're not getting my vote. These are things that we can do. We must take affirmative action to say we are going to do something with this information rather than sitting back and feeling like the wave of complacency of a judiciary that doesn't follow the law, of executives who actually run roughshod over human rights. If we're going to sit and watch the wave crash over us, then it's up to us to actually realize we did nothing. If, however, we take action, the actions we can take right now are putting people on notice and then secondarily holding them accountable. We do have that capacity. Here in the United States, we've got a midterm election coming up this year. I have said that there is no person who holds a fundraiser, no person who sits at a, whether it's a town hall meeting with a candidate, whether it is a community gathering with a candidate, no one walks in or out the door without having the question asked of them. Are you prepared to hold the criminals accountable for the COVID-19 acts of global terror? If they say no, do not elect them. These are things that we can be doing. And the tools that we need are already there. ProsecuteNow.com, which is a site that I set up with some of my colleagues in Utah, is a place where the three documents there are both the indictment, which actually lays out the felony crimes. Then we have the civil actions, which are the summary of litigation. And then we have a very simple to read summary. We actually cast it as a playbill for a theater. And we did it because sometimes you have to use a purple crayon to get through to people. So we actually did that too. What we've done is we put the tools in people's hands, and what's happened, in fact, starting on February 14th, so just a couple of days ago here, what happened was a number of people across the country printed out and got notarized their draft complaint for a criminal felony prosecution and took it to their district attorney's office. And the great news is a lot of the district attorneys to whom this was delivered were thankful because they had never heard this information. And so the point is, we can sit and pretend like this is overwhelming and somebody should be doing something, and we should wait for the savior to show up. We are the savior to show up. We have to take action, and we have to do what we can do. And the vast majority of people who are sitting there incensed, saying, this is a crime, it's horrible, it seems like nobody's doing anything. Well, as long as nobody includes you, you're part of the problem. So take action, do something. And I remind people time and time again, when we knew tobacco was killing people, most people did nothing, but some people took action. And over a period of time, legislation and litigation started, and the tobacco companies started being held accountable for cancer-causing behavior and this and that and the other thing. And behavior changed. Did it change overnight? No. Did one person have the magic bullet? No. What happened was people took action, and over time, the system got word that if you don't act, there's going to be a problem. That's what we have to do now. This is like smoking was in the 80s and early 90s. We have to start taking community level action. We have to be putting this issue in front of our elected officials and our law enforcement officials. And if they do not take action, we need to hold them accountable at the ballot box.
And if people need some motivation for doing that, Dr. Martin, can you talk to us about CRISPR and the plans for the future?
Oh, yeah, because what's coming next is far worse. Imagine a lifetime of dialysis, only this time Klaus Schwab is the one editing who you are. If you want to have a terrifying read of the future, have a look at the video. And I don't know, Maria, if you've shared this video on your website, but have a look at the video by Dr. Yuval Harari, where he talks about humans as hackable code. Well, hackable imagine animals
as well.
Yes. I mean, so we're just this hackable operating system that now we can actually write, rewrite, modify, whatever else. CRISPR is going to be dialysis for the injected. And what do I mean by that? Some of you know what dialysis is, some of you don't. What that is when your kidneys fail, and you're most often diabetic. There's other reasons why it happens, but most of the time with diabetes, you have to go and have your blood cleaned. And sometimes that's every couple of days, sometimes every couple of weeks. But you go and you have your blood cleaned because you have to get rid of stuff that is not being taken out of your system. Well, CRISPR is that to the whole of the human. So rather than your kidneys just not working, what we're going to do is every now and then you're going to need to actually go in for an upgrade. And the upgrade is going to be getting injected with a gene therapy where they cut in or cut out sequences of genes because you are dealing with pathogen-created illness, pathogen-created deficits. And what will happen is we will be addicted to a constant flow of in and out of clinics to make sure that the edit that they made yesterday, which has the oops, we didn't get it quite right, so come back and do it again the next day. It's like a bad computer application or a bad phone application that simply does not work. What will happen is we will change one thing. But Maria, the problem with the whole genome concept and the whole problem with the RNA concept is we simply do not know what happens when we think we're editing one thing and we accidentally get something else. What we know is that our track record on this is exceptionally bad. All we have to look at is the rise of gastrointestinal problems in the entire world population to prove the point. Because back in the 1970s and 1980s with the Green Revolution, we decided that genetically modified crops were a great idea to maximize production across the world, to make sure we could feed the world after all of the tragedies in the 1970s of famines and all kinds of food shortages and so forth. And so what we did was we magically decided that we would modify crops with this little thing called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. And you've heard about that, genetically modified crops, all of you using BT. What nobody seemed to do, except me, is go back and read the history of BT and BT exposure in crops. And what you'll find is in the early 1900s, between 1900 and 1907, the Japanese did an enormous amount of study on this and found out that it turns out that Bacillus thuringiensis produces a toxin, and the toxin actually makes your gut leak.
Right.
Now, did anybody tell you that when you had your first genetically modified corn or soybeans or anything, that what you were going to get was this amazingly prolific crop? But, oh, by the way, when you have your CCs at your, party, when you're watching, your favorite rugby team bang each other on the pitch, you're also giving yourself a toxin that is known to cause leaky gut. Is it any wonder that we have now 40% of the world's population that's irritable bowel syndrome or other digestive disorders or intolerances to every single thing that has anything to do with anything that might go through your gastrointestinal system? Of course, it's not a surprise, because we made endemic a modification to solve one problem to create a bigger problem. There are more people now who suffer from bowel problems than there were who suffered from food shortages. This is the problem. When we solve what we think is the problem, we make a modification that in the moment appears to be expedient. But then the danger is we don't think about the long-term consequence of what else could go wrong by using that solution. And that is a fundamental problem we, the people, have to address, because we can't keep taking this gimmick that says, give me the solution for this little narrow window problem, and don't bother telling me whether or not the solution you're giving me has been tested on 10 other things that are going to make it worse. I would submit to you that we as a human race are worse off now because of genetically modified crops than we would have been if we had pulses in food production. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to make industrial food production easy. And by changing one little thing, I mean, we're talking about a bacterium. We're talking about a little tiny bacterium. We changed that and we destroyed the human gut.
And it's going to get worse. Their plans for the way that they're going to control our food are going to be much worse.
Well, that's the point. That's why, thank God for this conversation, right? These conversations are the only hope that we have to wake enough people up to say, not on my watch. I will go and I will make sure my food is more actually suitable and organic. I'm going to pay attention to that. But even there, little nasty secret, you can spray kale with BT to keep lizards and butterflies and all kinds of other things off your kale. Well, the bad news is it's still considered organic certified if you've sprayed it with BT. And so all you kind of vegan kale promoting everybody else's, you got to find kale that didn't get BT on it. And that's a hard thing to find anywhere. The point of all of this is really simple. We need to expand our consciousness. We need to be thoughtful about what we put in our body. And that includes not only what we ingest and inject, but also what we listen to. We need to actually be aware that the clarity of the signal that comes into our head is actually as important as the quality of the nutrition that goes in our mouth.
Absolutely agreed. And the truth right now is one of the most precious and valuable things that we have. Dr. Martin, I just want you to quickly let everyone know where they can find you and where they can follow your work.
Well, Kim and I have a site called fullyliveacademy.com. Fullyliveacademy.com is where we promote a lot of the events that we do around the country and hopefully soon again around the world. We also have davidmartin.world, which is where a lot of my content resides. And then our litigation platform, which is now up and will be growing in the next couple of weeks, is called prosecutenow.com. So there's a lot of places to stay in touch. And most of all, Maria, the best way to stay in touch is I have been committed to making sure that I bring as much quality information to as many people as possible. I'm super grateful that you took the time to share this with your audience.
Well, we are grateful for you, Dr. Martin, and definitely we'll be speaking to you again in the future because these conversations are so crucial, especially in the prison land down under where we are so censored. Thank you again for your time, Dr.
You are
Martin.
most welcome. Have a beautiful, beautiful rest of your day.
And you also.